Hello everyone, and welcome to Fresh Master Channel. Today, we are going to have some story from Reddit. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe, like the video if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment down below. These simple clips mean a lot to the future of this channel.
Looking back, it's strange how everything fell apart. For years, I thought our life was solid, built on routine and respect. Sure, we had our disagreements, but nothing ever seemed serious enough to shake our marriage. It wasn't until recently that I realized I had been ignoring the deeper issues. What seemed like small frustrations had grown into real cracks, and I hadn't even noticed. Then came the phone call that shattered my sense of certainty. Marcy's voice was calm but final. I wanted to argue, but I stood frozen. It hit me. I'd been blind to changes I didn't know how to fix. I heard her voice, but it felt distant. My mind shut down and I couldn't respond. Everything around me blurred, and I was left in a strange stillness. "Gosh," I muttered. "What's wrong?" Leslie asked, breaking through my fog. I could only think that the marriage I had worked so hard to keep was slipping away. The phone call was bad enough, but now reading her letter made it feel final. I couldn't even recognize the person who had written it. Was this really the woman I married? "What does it say? Please tell me," Leslie urged. I couldn't process it. I must have misread. I needed to look at the letter again, hoping I'd find something to change it all. "Rick, are you okay? What's happening?" "In the Army, you're trained to bounce back quickly from trauma. On missions, I always managed to take control after chaos. I was in shock after reading Marcy's letter, but I didn't take long before I snapped into problem-solving mode. Rick was stunned, but my brain took over. First priority, send Leslie home without upsetting her. This wasn't her fault. It was between me and Marcy. "Rick, Leslie started. "Leslie, listen, thanks for coming tonight, but the letter blew up my life. Have you read it?" I asked, hesitating. "No, I'd never do that," she said, a bit hurt. "Okay, thanks for the company, but I need some time. Can we reschedule?" She looked surprised, but sad, not angry. "All right, Rick, you won't do anything stupid, right?" she asked, taking the Moscato from me. "Don't worry, and if I need anything, I won't hesitate to knock on your door," I said with a smile. I must have seemed calm enough because she smiled back before walking away. But my mind was on something else. Priority number 2, deal with my grief alone. I called the office and left a message that I'd be out for the rest of the week. Family issue, email only. My secretary would understand and not ask questions. Priority number 3, numb the pain. I downed my glass of Moscato and Leslie's too. Then I saw the letter again. In anger, I swiped it off the table. Leslie was gone, the logistics handled, but my peace was shattered. Grabbing a bottle of Jack Daniels, I sank into my chair. Forget the glass. Forget manners. I raised the bottle. "Here's to you," I muttered. "Go ahead. Sleep with your doctor, you idiot." I took a couple sips of Jack Daniels, but it tasted bitter in my mouth. I was furious, pretending to play soldier. Right. I spent hours cursing my wife, downing the whiskey, until I passed out. When I finally woke up, the sun was high, 12:20. I hadn't slept that long since I was a teenager. The bottle of Jack was empty on the floor, and I knew I'd downed most of it last night. Getting out of that chair was tough, both because I'd slept in it for 14 hours, and because at 48, my back's not what it used to be. My head and stomach were in complete agreement with my back. Jack had been a friend last night, but now I needed medicine. I stepped out onto the deck for coffee and felt relieved that the thick hedge between my yard and the Nielsen's meant no small talk with nosy neighbors. They knew too much and would ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I briefly considered locking the gate, but I didn't want to send the wrong signal. I wasn't mad at them. I was mad at my wife. When my stomach signaled it was time to eat, I made breakfast and went back outside. All I could think about was sneaking into Bogota, catching her and her doctor in their hotel room, and making them pay. He's playing soldier. You want to see how a real soldier plays, huh? Saving lives isn't a game. Does she think it is? I barely kept myself from screaming. How could she compare my brief, accidental moment with Deirdre to her 6-week affair in South America? A squirrel next to a tiger. Did she really think I'd just swallow it? If so, she's not only unfaithful, she's stupid. If someone bumps into you on the street, do you shoot them? If this is Marcy's idea of balancing the scales, she's in for a shock. Later that afternoon, my son Kyle called. "Hey, Dad, how are you?" "Hey, son, not bad. I'm catching up on work while your mom's away. How about you?" "Same old at school. How's Mom? I haven't heard from her." Marcy usually called the kids twice a week. Kyle didn't mind, but Rhonda thought it was overbearing, though she was hard to reach anyway. Don't worry, she's fine. She checked into her hotel and said they're traveling to some remote places with spotty reception. I hated lying to my kids, but I didn't want to tell them what was really happening. No matter how mad I was, I couldn't badmouth her to them. She was still their mom. Okay, Dad. Let me know if you hear from her. I'll send her a message too. Take care, son, and don't miss the game on Saturday, I joked. No chance, Dad. Love you. Kyle laughed and hung up. I put the phone down, relieved. Kyle wouldn't call again for a few weeks, giving me time to plan. Rhonda, stationed on a warship, rarely called, so I didn't expect to hear from her for at least 3 weeks. Noticing the empty Jack Daniels bottle, I rummaged through the closet and found a bottle of Amarone della Valpolicella, 2003, saved for some unknown special occasion. I decided today, a celebration of my freedom after 24 years of marriage to a lying cheater, was that occasion. I poured a glass, then noticed our framed photo on the mantel. Damn you, I muttered, hurling the frame at the wall. I returned to my chair, cursing my situation. I'd sacrificed so much for my career, and this is where it got me. I'll call Deirdre tomorrow, I thought. My only regret in the Middle East was not taking things further with her. I saw the attacks as a sign to stop, but I should have taken it as a reminder that life is short. Raising my glass, I added, Marcy, you wanted revenge? I'll give you a real reason to hate me. I finished the bottle and went to bed, which was an improvement over the previous night. Thursday was slightly better, though I was still furious. I didn't clean up the broken glass and ended up stepping on a shard. I spent most of the day in my chair, lining up empty beer cans where her photo used to be. Later, Leslie knocked on the door. Just what I needed, more questions. I limped to the door, and her face fell when she saw me. Oh my God, Rick, you look awful. Maybe go home, Leslie. Leave me alone, I shouted, slamming the door. I waited for her to leave, then went back to my chair. The beer cans were better company. They didn't ask questions or try to set me up with someone. That night, I finally made a plan. I'd go to Marcy's hospital and talk to the president, showing him her letter. The hospital had a strict policy against employee relationships. If they didn't fire her and the doctor, I'd make sure they got sued. I wouldn't gain anything, but it would be sweet revenge. And before that, I'd call Deirdre. Marcy wasn't the only woman in the world. I could find someone else easily. I woke the next morning to my work phone ringing. It took a few seconds to process. It was 5 a.m. Who calls at 5 a.m.? Rick Weston. Bonjour, Rick. This is Laurent Dutchmain, Ministry of Security, Para. Okay. My French is good, but at 5 a.m., and still feeling the effects of last night's alcohol, I wasn't ready for this. I knew Laurent a bit from past work between French and American intelligence. He was always direct and efficient. Bonjour, Laurent. What's the reason for the early call? Early? It's 8 a.m. here. I thought you were in Washington. No, I'm on the West Coast. It's 5 a.m. here. Oh, my mistake. Sorry, Rick. It's fine. What's going on? A complex situation involving multiple countries had come up, and my company was the main consulting partner. It was serious and needed immediate attention. 3 minutes into the call, I was fully awake. My professional focus kicked in. We spoke for nearly an hour, and by the time I hung up, I had a clear sense of how the next week would play out. My plans to call Deirdre and confront the hospital president would have to wait. After a long shower and a decent breakfast, I spent the day reading reports, calling colleagues in London, Washington, and Ottawa, and preparing for the coming days. I tried calling Deirdre, but it went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. By 4:30 p.m., it was too late to go to the hospital, so I postponed it for the next week. I emailed my secretary, confirming I'd be in the office on Monday, finished up some work, and decided to go to a restaurant. Better to eat alone than stare at photos of my unfaithful wife. I had fish and chips. Maybe not the healthiest, but I stayed away from alcohol. That night, I went to bed early, exhausted from the week's stress. The next morning, I woke up feeling surprisingly refreshed. As my coffee brewed, the phone rang. Hello, this is Rick. Since when do you call and not leave a message? Teased a familiar voice. Deirdre, wow, long time no see. I quickly filled her in on my awful week, and she was shocked. Oh my God, Ricky, Marcy doesn't sound like the woman you described back in the Middle East. No, she's changed, and I didn't see it in time. Hey, why don't you come over tonight? I'll cook something better than whatever you've been eating all week, she offered. I learned she'd moved nearby recently and had a new house. Since it was a 90-minute drive, she suggested I bring what I needed to stay the night, which, honestly, had already been part of my plan. First, I needed to apologize to Leslie for being rude when she came by 2 days ago. Around noon, I walked across our backyards, and Leslie saw me before I even knocked, opening the door with a slight smile. "How are you, Rick?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Much better, thanks. Listen, I'm really sorry for how I treated you Thursday night. Too much beer on a bad day is never good. I apologize." Her face lit up. "Apology accepted, Rick. I'm glad to see you're feeling better." "Colonel, have time for a drink?" Vincent called as he walked down the stairs. "No, thanks. I've got other plans today. But if you're up for dinner sometime, our doors are always open," he added with a wink. Leslie blushed. "I know where you're going with this," I said. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted, but this isn't the right time. Spiting my wife like that isn't the answer, no matter what she said before she left." "I get it," Leslie said, disappointed. "But maybe we can talk over dinner sometime. I'm really curious about this lifestyle." "We'd be honored," Vincent grinned. I went home to finish preparing for the night. I debated bringing Marcy's letter, still lying on the kitchen floor. I didn't dare reread it, but decided to tuck it in my bag. It might come in handy as an excuse later. A few minutes later, I was on my way, feeling like a teenager on a first date. Deirdre Keel had always been a bit of a mystery, constantly traveling, always on missions, never at home for long. So I was surprised to see the beautiful two-story house she had bought in a prestigious new area. When she saw me get out of the car, she practically ran to greet me. "So great to see you, Ricky." She kissed me warmly, and I hugged her. But right there in the driveway, as I held her, the floodgates opened. I broke down and cried like a child. "Come inside," Deirdre said softly. "We'll talk." We sat on her terrace, and she brought us homemade sangria, giving me time to calm down. "Okay, Ricky, you have my full attention. Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the last few years, returning from the Middle East, my second career, and how Marcy became head nurse in neurosurgery. Then I talked about the months before Marcy left for Colombia and her affair with Trey, the doctor. Deirdre handed me a box of tissues as I spoke. She listened quietly, only asking a few questions for clarity. Finally, I handed her Marcy's letter. Deirdre read it carefully, trying not to react. "Oh, we're definitely playing soldiers," she said, slipping the letter back into the envelope before sitting in silence for a moment. Before I could ask, Deirdre spoke. "Rick, I swear I never told Marcy we slept together when I visited her. Yes, I remember what happened, and I'm not proud of it. I wouldn't brag about it either." "Then why did you visit her that day?" I asked. "I wanted to calm her down. She was worried sick, and I knew she wouldn't tell you. Honestly, Rick, you've always been great at strategy, but when it comes to emotions, you're clueless. You didn't do much to reassure her." "Thanks for the compliment," I replied sarcastically. "No, it's not that you don't understand emotions. You just ignore them. You treat them like distractions. But life doesn't work that way." Deirdre was always blunt, never holding back. If you wanted the truth, she was the one to ask. As the sun set, she headed to the kitchen, and I followed with the empty glasses. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. I had a lot to think about. Deirdre had prepped dinner, and I grilled the tuna steaks she'd been marinating all day. "So, what do you mean by late bloomer?" I asked as she set the table outside. "Marcy was essentially a single mom while you were away in Korea and the Middle East. She had a job, but her family came first. She only really started to blossom when you came home for good." "I get that, but why the betrayal? Revenge?" Deirdre thought for a moment. "Yes and no." "Explain." "Maybe it's revenge because she thinks we slept together in the Middle East. Did you ever explain what really happened?" She didn't want to hear it. "Typical. Did you keep trying?" I sighed. "No, not really." "There you go. She still thinks we had an affair, but honestly, I don't think that's the main issue." "So what else?" I asked, confused. "Well, it's more than just revenge. Marcy's career took off late in life, and now she's thriving. She's on this mission abroad, feeling powerful for the first time. Success can make people feel entitled, like they can take whatever they want. I think Marcy feels invincible, and she doesn't believe you'll ever leave her." I was taken aback. I hadn't noticed. "You've given me a lot to think about, Deirdre. Thanks." "Happy to help, but let's not forget those tuna steaks." Dinner was delicious, and the wine paired perfectly. The rest of the evening was light and fun, with Deirdre sharing her own stories. "Quite a big house for someone who's always on the go," I teased. "I'm not getting younger. Maybe it's time to settle down." "I can't picture you settling down," I joked. "You'd be surprised," she grinned. "Okay, what's his name?" "There are a few," she laughed. "There always are." But if I ever want a real relationship, I need a home base, she said, a hint of nostalgia in her voice. The last few years have been tough, huh? Yeah, I live for work. Now I want to work and live. I know it sounds cliche, but that's where I'm at. Deirdre shared details of her last assignment in Afghanistan. She wasn't in a combat zone, but dealing with clueless people made the job exhausting. Her stories were fun to listen to, and her laughter was infectious. When it was time for bed, I went to the guest room, which was fine by me. I knew Deirdre had a soft spot for me, but I didn't think either of us wanted to cross that line, and the fantasy I'd had the past few days faded. The next morning, I woke up before her and checked my messages. Kyle was happy about his team's win, but there was nothing from Marcy. Deirdre came into the kitchen smiling, and I offered to make French pancakes. Despite her skepticism, I managed to make a decent batch, and we ate like an old couple, silently reading the papers. Finally, I asked, "Do you think Marcy and I are done?" She put down her paper, took a sip of coffee, and said, "I could be wrong, but I don't see a future for you two." Her bluntness caught me off guard, but that was Deirdre. Honest, no sugarcoating. "I appreciate your honesty," I said. She continued, "Marcy's disrespect for your marriage and what we did as soldiers shows she doesn't have feelings for you anymore. She didn't say goodbye before leaving, didn't write when she arrived. In her mind, you're already part of the past." I hugged Deirdre goodbye, thanked her, and promised to stay in touch. On the drive home, I kept thinking, what if only, maybe I should have. But I knew I couldn't go back. When I got home in the afternoon, I noticed the Nielsens weren't around, so I worked in the yard without interruptions. I wasn't sure if I was ready to return to the office the next day. That night, I couldn't sleep, struggling to accept that my marriage might be over. There had to be a solution, something I'd missed. I still had 5 weeks to figure it out. Monday was spent planning the week, and though I wasn't eager, it became clear I'd need to go to Ottawa by the end of the week. My assistant, Miss Matthews, respected my privacy despite her curiosity about my absence. I decided to update her on the situation, so we had lunch where I briefly explained the events. She was shocked but supportive, as always, without offering opinions. Talking about it helped me clear my thoughts. On the flight to Ottawa, I wondered how to save my marriage. Should I follow Marcy's requests to prove my loyalty? Would doing so win her back, or would it only earn more contempt? I also thought about Leslie. Having closeness with her just to spite Marcy seemed pointless. Leslie was attractive, but I'd never wanted a relationship with someone half my age. I was relieved I hadn't slept with Deirdre. It would have been revenge act, and I couldn't bear using her like that. I didn't want to do that to Leslie either. I respected my neighbor's lifestyle, but wasn't about to exploit it in my own hard times. That evening in the hotel room, I couldn't shake my thoughts. One unresolved issue was Josh. Should I tell him what I overheard on the phone? I wasn't sure. Josh wasn't a close friend, but I still felt he deserved to know, just as I'd want to be told. How would Josh react? Honestly, I had no idea. If I showed up at the Ambassador Hotel next month, as Marcy asked, would I find a wife eager to reconcile? Or someone ready to announce a divorce? Or maybe she wouldn't show up at all. As I prepared for my trip that week, I didn't have time to visit the hospital to discuss Marcy's affair with the president. But would it even matter if we were heading for divorce? Would confronting them stop her affair? And did I even want to stay married to someone who felt obligated to be with me? I spent a few days in Washington meeting with federal agents and Canadian colleagues. By the time I returned home, I was in the 3rd week of Marcy's trip, still full of questions and unsure about the future. Sitting in my chair that Friday night, I couldn't understand why Marcy was so angry about what she thought happened between me and Deirdre in the Middle East, even though she had been unfaithful during my time in Korea. Clearly, her revenge wasn't complete. I needed answers. When Lydia had emailed me about Marcy's whereabouts, I thanked her, but didn't ask for more details. I got an explanation from the private investigator, but I never asked Lydia why Marcy was at the Red Roof Inn an hour before her shift. I didn't want to drag it out over email. I decided to visit Lydia the next day. I drove to her house, located in a middle-class neighborhood. After calling twice, a man around my age answered. "Yes?" he asked, looking at me with an intense gaze. "Good morning. I'm an old friend of Lydia's, just stopping by to say hello. Haven't seen her in years." After a long pause, he said, "No one told you?" "My wife died in a car accident 6 months ago." I was stunned. "I'm so sorry for your loss," I said, offering my hand. "Thank you," he replied quietly. I left, still in shock, and stopped down the road to collect my thoughts. Though I hadn't seen Lydia in years, her death hit me hard. That was it. I wouldn't learn more about Marcy's actions. Later that day, I got a call. Rick Weston. Hey, Rick, it's Josh Washington. Morning, Josh. How are you handling things? I was hoping we could talk about that. Meet me at O'Grady's in half an hour? I arrived early and ordered a pint. The place was nearly empty, typical for a Sunday afternoon. Josh arrived shortly after, looking serious. I had a feeling I knew what he wanted to discuss. After some small talk, he got straight to the point. Rick, Penny called me on Skype yesterday, and she was in tears. It took her a while to speak, but she finally admitted that the day after arriving in Bogota, she slept with one of the doctors, Dr. Evans. Oh, okay. How did you react? I asked, curious about his thoughts. I stayed calm. I asked if it was just a fling or something more. She said it only happened once, and she regretted it the next day. She cried for 2 weeks and couldn't live with it anymore. I thanked her for being honest and told her we'd talk when she got back and that I wasn't mad. Honestly, I was surprised by how calm I was. So, what's your plan? Stay calm now and hand her divorce papers at the airport? No, I won't do that. I've had my own affairs, maybe 2 or 3, so getting mad at her would be hypocritical. That's why I asked you here for advice. You're thinking of telling her about your affairs, right? Yeah, but I'm worried she'll be upset that I didn't tell her sooner. It's possible, but you know Penny better than I do. Josh's face grew serious. There's more. Penny said Marcy is also involved in something. Apparently, she's seeing Dr. Trey. I paused before answering. Yeah, I know. Marcy's having a full-blown affair with him. She wrote me a letter about it before she left. It's her way of getting back at me for something she thinks happened in the Middle East. Did you cheat? Josh asked. Remember, we kissed for 15 minutes in shock after a bomb went off near us. That's it. You're a firefighter. You understand that feeling. So, what now? Divorce seems like the logical step, but the idea of divorcing over a misunderstanding is eliminating me, I said, fighting back tears. Josh sighed, and we sat in silence for a moment before he spoke again. Penny told me about Trey weeks ago. All the women at the hospital are crazy about him. Marcy probably thinks she's lucky. Yeah, maybe, I replied, annoyed. We continued our beers with dinner, and the conversation shifted, lightening the mood. The rest of the week was a blur of work, as government agencies kept pushing me to solve the latest crisis. In the evenings, I'd break down, overwhelmed by what my life had become. I knew I had to make a decision. One night, I carefully weighed my options. Option 1, meet Marcy at the Ambassador Hotel as she asked, let her tell me how things are, and see if there's any chance to fix things. This option made me uncomfortable. It gave her all the power. She could even show up with Trey and tell me it was over. I felt like I'd been humiliated enough. Option 2, close all joint credit cards, open a new bank account in my name, transfer half of our joint funds, rent an apartment, move my things, and file for divorce. Then hand her the papers in the hotel lobby and let my lawyer handle the rest. It was a clean, straightforward option, and probably what most people would advise. But the thought of it brought tears to my eyes. It would be painful, but maybe the pain wouldn't last long. Option 3 was to send Marcy a message or email saying I wouldn't be meeting her at the Ambassador because I had filed for divorce, and she would be served there, but this wasn't ideal. Marcy might not check her messages, and even if she did, she'd likely try to contact me, and I didn't want a long-distance argument. Option 4 was to disappear without a trace. This would lead to divorce within a year, but I didn't like the idea of living in hiding. Not the life I wanted. Option 5 was a revenge tactic. The day before she returned, send copies of Marcy's letter to our children, parents, and friends, then leave for a 2-week vacation in the Caribbean. It was tempting, but not my style. I didn't want to expose our private issues or be seen as a victim. In the end, it wouldn't resolve anything, and I'd be left with the same problems. Unfortunately, option 6, where the last month never happened, was impossible. All 5 options seemed to lead to divorce. Filing for divorce felt inevitable, and I realized I needed to act. I knew a few lawyers and decided to make some calls. On Monday, I scheduled an appointment with attorney Doug Atwater, known for getting things done quickly. He came off as aggressive and a bit rude, and we clashed right away. I explained the situation and handed him Marcy's letter. How long has she been gone? He asked. Almost 4 weeks, I replied. 3 weeks to realize divorce is the only option? He said with a mix of surprise and contempt. Yes, I answered. What more proof do you need that she doesn't care about you? His tone was meant to push me from sadness into action. I told him I wasn't concerned about material things. I just wanted it over quickly. I asked him to draft papers that Marcy wouldn't fight, so we could avoid dragging it out. He seemed reluctant, but agreed. Atwater said the documents would be ready by Friday. He'd send a copy to my office and arrange for Marcy to be served at the Ambassador Hotel 2 hours after her flight landed. The following week was one of the busiest of my career. I worked from 6 in the morning to 10 at night, spending days on the phone with Europe and evenings handling paperwork. Kyle texted a couple of times, mentioning his final exams were coming up. He'd be home in 4 weeks, 2 weeks after Marcy returned. I doubted the situation would be resolved by then. It was strange that Kyle hadn't heard from Marcy, but he assumed, based on what I'd told him about her schedule, that she wouldn't contact him before returning. Rhonda called just to check in, and like Kyle, she hadn't heard from Marcy either, which wasn't surprising given her workload. I came home exhausted every evening that week, and the guy from the takeout place nearby quickly became my best friend. I didn't have the energy to pack or look for an apartment, so that would have to wait. I also didn't meet with the hospital president. What was the point if Marcy and I were divorcing? I worked all day Saturday and spent Sunday doing chores and gardening. While watering the garden, I heard Vincent calling Leslie from inside. I walked over to say hello. Vincent greeted me with a big smile and asked how I was doing. "I'm feeling better, more at peace than 4 weeks ago," I replied. "Glad to hear it. Any news from Marcy?" he asked. "Not really. She's in places without much signal." "Hey, Vincent, can I take you up on that dinner offer?" "Of course. How about this Friday? I've got some steaks to grill," he said happily. "Perfect. See you Friday," I agreed. The next week was just as busy, leaving me no time to think. On Friday morning, a courier delivered my copies of the divorce papers. I treated the envelope like Marcy's letter, something I didn't want to open. It could wait. Then, just before lunch, everything changed. Laurent Dutchman called to say our situation in Europe was getting worse. I called my colleagues and realized I'd have to go to Europe for at least 10 days, meaning I wouldn't be home when Marcy returned the following Friday. This ruled out option 1 since I had never seriously considered options 3, 4, or 5. My only choice was option 2, but I wouldn't be there to discuss it with her. She'd have to figure things out herself, just as I had been left to do for the past 5 weeks. On my way home, I bought a couple of bottles of wine, took a quick shower, and headed to the Nielsen's. Leslie greeted me warmly, and thankfully, there were no sexual undertones this time. Vincent couldn't stop praising the new butcher shop where he'd found the steaks. Dinner was great, the food was excellent, and the company was enjoyable. I shared more details about Marcy's letter, but didn't mention filing for divorce. Maybe it was my way of letting Marcy explain the chaos she caused. After dinner, we cleared the table and sat on the terrace with glasses of port. With the wine flowing, I decided to ask something that had been on my mind. "So, I'm curious, how did you two start sharing Leslie with other men?" They were surprised, but Vincent quickly recovered. "It started as a fantasy. Years ago, we were watching a documentary about unusual sexual practices, and Leslie seemed especially interested when they talked about partner swapping. After the show, I teased her, and she admitted it had been a long-time fantasy of hers. That intrigued me too, and after nearly a year of talking, we decided to try it." "Do you both swap partners, or is it just Leslie with other men? Do you also sleep with other women?" "Sometimes, but it's not my main fantasy. We started by dating other couples, but I realized I get the most pleasure from watching Leslie with other men. I've been with other women, but none of them gave me the same thrill as Leslie." He leaned in and whispered, "Leslie is amazing in bed. Her body is perfect, and her energy is like a nuclear bomb." Leslie blushed. "So there's no real incentive for you to sleep with other women?" I asked. "No," Vincent said. "It happens sometimes, but it's becoming less frequent." "Do you ever feel jealous watching Leslie with other men?" I asked. "No, not at all," Vincent replied. "Leslie never meets them in secret. Everything is open, and afterward we make love and talk about it, sometimes even laughing." "So you both see it as a shared experience, without feeling forced or left out?" "Exactly," Vincent confirmed. "You got it." "Do you view this as a hobby, separate from your marriage vows?" I asked. "Yes," Leslie chimed in. "Love is love, and Zex is Zex. I've never broken my vows because Vincent and I agree on what we do with our bodies." "It's normal after years of marriage to wonder what it's like with others," Vincent added. "What were my choices? Cheat on Leslie or explore this with her?" The second option was full of possibilities. I nodded. "I'm intrigued, but I don't think I could ever watch Marcy with another man. Knowing it happened is bad enough, but seeing it would be unbearable." Vincent gave me a sympathetic look. Your situation is different, Rick. Marcy did it behind your back and gave you a free pass afterward, hoping that would make up for it. But she didn't have the open, honest conversation that's crucial. Leslie added, I don't think she did it because she doesn't love you anymore, Rick. She probably just wanted to explore something new, but she handled it badly. Exactly, Vincent agreed. She didn't get your consent, and that's the key difference. After a long hug with both of them, I headed home. It had been a surprising and eye-opening conversation, and to my surprise, I saw some logic in their lifestyle. My flight to London was set for Tuesday, and I still had plenty to do. I wanted the house in perfect shape when Marcy returned, not to impress her, but for my own sense of pride. I cleaned everything except for a photo frame I had thrown against the wall, which had been lying broken for weeks. It felt like a symbol. On Monday evening, I made a gin and tonic to mark what could be my last night in the house. With my bags packed and everything in order, I sat down, expecting to feel at peace after all the decisions I had made. But something still felt off. I walked into the kitchen and saw the large envelope with the divorce papers, which I still hadn't opened. I sat down and skimmed through them. Everything was in order as I requested, and I doubted Marcy would argue. 24 years of marriage, reduced to paperwork. I sat there deep in thought when it hit me. Marcy's letter. Where was it? I found it in my bag from the trip to Deirdre's. I hadn't reread it since the night Marcy left. I sat down and read it again. And then again. Suddenly things became clearer. Sometimes things aren't as complicated as they seem. Hello, this is Doug Atwater. Hi, Doug. It's Rick Weston. Sorry to call so late, but this can't wait. It's fine, Rick. How can I help? I want you to stop the divorce. Don't serve my wife the papers this Friday. Rick, that's unexpected. I thought we agreed this was the only solution, Doug replied. Doug, I'm leaving for Europe tomorrow and we'll be back next week. I think the divorce is a hasty decision, and I don't want to rush it. Rick, this sounds like denial. Don't you think your wife has shown enough disrespect? Doug, stop. You're my lawyer, not my therapist. I have my reasons. Will you pause the case? After a deep sigh, Doug Atwater agreed to pause the divorce process and wait for my further instructions. I sat at the table in my home office and began writing a long letter. I rewrote it several times, wanting my thoughts to be perfectly clear. Well past midnight, I finally finished. On my way to the airport Tuesday morning, I stopped by the courier service I used for work and sent the letter, with specific instructions to deliver it to Mrs. Marcy Weston at the Ambassador Hotel on Friday. By 4 p.m., Marcy realized she had been rereading the same line for 10 minutes and admitted she wasn't in the mood to read. Fatigue from the trip made her sleep almost the entire flight from Asunción to Bogotá, but the chaotic Bogotá airport, where she was catching a connecting flight to the U.S., left her unsettled. She couldn't sleep now, unlike Penny Washington, who was peacefully napping next to her. Penny's journey had been tumultuous. She shared Marcy's excitement upon arriving in Bogotá and ended up sleeping with Dr. Mark Evans, known for his reputation at the hospital. However, after Rick's call to Marcy, Penny was consumed by guilt. When she finally confessed to her husband, Josh, over the phone, his calm reaction brought her immense relief. Josh even admitted to past affairs, which initially infuriated Penny, but eventually settled their relationship. She now looked forward to going home to her husband. Marcy's thoughts, however, were more conflicted. She signed up for this trip to prove to herself that she was more than just Rick Weston's wife. She needed to do something on her own, away from the constant presence of her husband, children, parents, and friends. But as the trip went on, guilt for not contacting her family grew stronger. She had wanted to call Rick many times, but held back, determined to follow through with her need for space. She wanted Rick to feel her absence, but she also feared what might happen while she was gone. Marcy wondered if Rick had taken advantage of her absence to visit their son, watch some baseball, or enjoy time with friends. Or worse, had he slept with Leslie? Leslie, maybe allowing him to sleep with her had been a mistake. How would Rick feel after weeks of sex with their young, athletic neighbor? Would he still find Marcy attractive? And what if he wanted to continue seeing Leslie? Despite her doubts, Marcy missed Rick terribly. She fantasized about candlelit dinners and hoped Rick missed her too, at least a little. These thoughts weighed on her mind as the plane flew over the Gulf of Mexico. After landing and clearing customs, Marcy was relieved Rick wasn't waiting nervously by the baggage carousel. She half expected him to be there, but Rick wasn't one to follow orders without military rank. Saying goodbye to Penny and the rest of the group, she drove to the Ambassador Hotel. Rick was nowhere in sight when she entered the hotel lobby. Following instructions to the letter for the first time in his life, she thought with a chuckle. Within 5 minutes of entering her room, she was in the shower, letting the warm water wash away the fatigue. Still wrapped in a towel, she heard a knock on the door. "Rick Weston, you will never change," Marcy muttered with a smirk. But instead of Rick, a young woman stood at the door. "Are you Marcy Weston?" the woman asked. Marcy's face went pale. "Yes, that's me," she replied, barely able to speak. "This letter is for you. Have a nice day." Marcy took the letter with trembling hands. Closing the door, she sat on the bed, took a few deep breaths to calm down, and opened the letter. "Dear Marcy, as you've probably noticed, I've respected your need for space and haven't tried to contact you during your trip. It hasn't been easy. These last 6 weeks have been some of the most painful of my life. But that's not why I'm writing. I'm not angry and I don't want to make you feel guilty. In fact, I'm grateful for the letter you left before you went. It helped me understand things I hadn't noticed for years. When I first read it, my gut reaction was to fly to Bogota, punch your Dr. Trey in the face, and drag you home. Thankfully, 6 weeks is a long time, long enough to think things through. I would have liked to talk at least once a week, but I respected your rules. Now, I've come to my own conclusions, which might differ from yours. First, let's talk about something that's clearly been bothering you, whether Deirdre and I had sex in the Middle East. The short answer is, in a way, yes. Was it intentional? Number after the ambush, while we were both in shock, Deirdre and I kissed in an empty office. I didn't stop her, and I kissed her back. But it didn't go further because sirens went off, and we had to evacuate. Why did it happen? Surviving a near-death experience can make you act impulsively, as if you're living on borrowed time. It wasn't about romance or promises, but about living in the moment, not knowing if tomorrow would come. That's what happened in the Middle East. There was nothing planned, and it never happened again. After you left, I visited Deirdre, and I stayed the night, not with her, but in her guest room. She helped me make sense of my life, but there's nothing romantic between us. I'm not in love with her, but she's a good friend. Next, I want to talk about the 6 months I spent deployed in Korea. When we met in Hawaii, you said I was complacent and distant. You were right. I wasn't sharing my thoughts with you, and that was my mistake. I should have opened up instead of acting like an idiot. A few days before you arrived in Hawaii, I received a letter from my ex, Lydia Steele. She mentioned seeing your car parked at the Red Roof Inn every morning before your shift. At first, I thought you might have been having an affair while I was in Korea again. Later, I learned the hospital parking lot was under construction, and employees had to park elsewhere. Red Roof Inn was a convenient option, but I still don't understand why you arrived so early. Lydia died in a car accident a few months ago, so I'll never get her perspective. I'm hoping you'll explain it. Finally, let's address the topic of Leslie. I understand you wanted me to have love with her. Well, I didn't, and here's why. First, I'm 48 and she's 30. You know I've always preferred women closer to my age. Leslie is attractive, but she's too young for me. Second, it would have been revenge act, and that's not how I view sex. For me, it's about pleasure, not payback. Last Friday, I had dinner with Leslie and Vincent. We had great steaks, some port, and a lot of conversation, including partner swapping, but it was just talk. Now let's move on to your trip and the content of your letter. This may surprise you, Marcy, but if you had told me you felt the need to sleep with someone else, I would have been open to a frank conversation about it over a bottle of wine. I would have shared my feelings and fantasies, and maybe we could have explored something new together. But you chose a different path. You left without saying goodbye, didn't let me know you'd arrived safely, and left me a letter 2 days later, essentially saying you wanted to cut me out of your life for 6 weeks to live your own and enjoy a romance. You arranged for me to sleep with our neighbor to ease your own guilt. And the subtle jabs about my career and playing soldier? They hurt, Marcy, and they still hurt. It took your trip and affair for me to fully understand how angry you've been at me for all the time I was away. I keep wondering how we ended up here. 3 things come to mind. First, I think you resent me for having a successful career while you were left to raise the family. You managed the kids, the house, the bills, and everything else, which left you with neither the energy nor the opportunity to pursue your own career. Second, when I retired, you finally got the chance to focus on your career, and now you're recognized as the best nurse at the hospital. It gave you new wings, and you felt like you deserved the freedom to fly wherever you wanted after being held back for so long. I get that. I would have felt the same way. I would have been happy to talk to you about it, maybe even celebrate with you. But you were too angry with me to share that. Third, and perhaps the biggest reason we're in this mess, is that over the years, we've done a terrible job of communicating. Marcy, I've always been grateful for everything you've done for me and our family, but my mistake was telling everyone except you. I've been so proud of your success, but again, I told others, and not you. If you had shared your feelings with me and I'd listened, things could have been so different. I'm afraid it might be too late now, Marcy. We may have grown too far apart to fix things. That's why I contacted a lawyer and prepared divorce papers, which I was going to give you today. But your letter gave me a sliver of hope. Maybe there's still something left to save. So I've decided not to let things fall apart without opening the door to an honest conversation. By now, you've likely guessed that I won't be meeting you in the lobby today. There are two reasons for that. First, I'm a coward. When you told me that Dr. Trey was just a fling, that you didn't love him, I believed you. But how do things stand now after living with him for 6 weeks? Have you fallen in love with him? Maybe he's sitting next to you right now as you read this letter. I can't face the possibility of meeting you in the lobby and being told we're over, that you're now with him. That's more than I can handle right now. The second reason I won't meet you today is logistical. I'm in Paris. Yes, I'm still traveling. Security issues related to international affairs. I flew out last Tuesday, had a layover in London, and arrived in Paris today. I'll be back next Thursday. My flight schedule is in the envelope. When I return, I suggest we meet at the Ambassador Hotel, just as you wanted to today. If you show up, I'll know 3 things. First, you still want to be my wife. Second, your affair with Trey is over. And third, you're ready to take the lessons from the past and make our marriage better. Don't come if any of these is missing. Also, please don't try to contact me before then. I want your decision to meet me to come from your own thoughts. If you don't show up within 2 hours of my arrival, I'll know and accept that it's over. I won't be angry or resentful. I'll just cry a little more and then try to move on. Whatever happens, Marcy, I want to apologize for everything I did that may have contributed to this sad situation. I remember the last thing you wrote in your letter and what you said on the phone, that you love me. I love you too, Marcy. Crazy. And I'm holding on to it. With love, Rick. Marcy lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling for several minutes before she could gather her thoughts. Oh my God, I definitely didn't expect this, she said aloud, tears streaming down her face. She had always believed she loved Rick more than he loved her. In her mind, she was just one part of Rick's life, with his career always coming first. She felt like he resented her for making him stop flying. Their life had been normal. Not perfect, but normal, like many couples. She never imagined Rick would do such deep soul-searching about their marriage. She thought her trip would be a wake-up call for him, nothing more. She joked in her letter that Rick might want a divorce, but she never truly believed he'd seriously consider it. Unless he's joking, she thought. But no, that's not like him. She couldn't believe Rick was so deeply affected by her actions, or that these 6 weeks had been such torment for him. She ordered dinner and a bottle of red wine for her room. Rick wasn't coming, but she wasn't ready to return to their empty house just yet. I've always hated flying to and from Europe. 11 hours crammed in a plane is pure torture for the nerves and back. I was irritated as we finally landed after a chaotic flight, but relieved that we'd fixed the information leak in Europe before it gained public attention. Now, I could finally focus on the most pressing issue. Marcy. Apart from not meeting her at the hotel last Friday, I had followed her requests. I even took disease tests in London last week. I chuckled to myself, thinking about the irony of sitting in a London clinic after not having love with anyone since Marcy left. The nurse was losing patience as she struggled to find a vein in my arm. As I drove to the hotel after landing, I realized I hadn't worked out a plan B if Marcy didn't show up. My nerves kicked in as I took the elevator from the parking lot to the main lobby. I was right on time, and there were no messages from her saying she'd be late. The lobby was nearly empty, except for a woman sitting anxiously by the door. "Hi, Marcy," I said softly from behind. She jumped up and threw herself into my arms. "Rick, God, I missed you so much," she said, sobbing. We hugged for almost a minute before I gently pulled back and smiled at her. "Rick, I'm so sorry for everything," she said, taking my face in her hands. I kissed her forehead. "Shall we rent a room, beautiful?" I asked with a wink. We got a room, ordered lunch and wine. Half an hour later, once we were in the room, I asked Marcy to wait while I took a quick shower to freshen up after the long flight. "Sorry for the delay, but I needed it," I said. "Yes, it was necessary," Marcy replied with a teasing laugh. She waited with a glass of Pinot Noir and a piece of paper. I eyed her cautiously. "This is my clean bill of health," she said, grinning. I laughed and showed her mine. Marcy, can you confirm that Dr. Trey is no longer part of the picture? I asked, haunted by uncertainty for the past 7 weeks. Trey. Marcy almost laughed. Rick, I ended things with Trey the same night you called me in Bogota. After we hung up, we continued what we were doing, but he started bragging and insulting you. I didn't like it. I stopped, looked at him, got my things, and went to my room. He barely spoke to me for the rest of the trip. Things were icy, even in the operating rooms. Marcy, I've spent 7 weeks worrying that you'd fall in love with him, and that the two of you would come back here together, I admitted. Rick, that was never going to happen. Your call that night made me realize what a jerk he was, and I wasn't the only one. He alienated the entire group within 2 weeks. I took Marcy's hands. Marcy, you have no idea how happy I am to be sitting here with you today, I said, tears welling up in my eyes. Rick, my love, we've been living in 2 different worlds these past 2 months. It's time for us to reconnect. We talked for hours, leaving nothing out. Marcy had come to terms with what happened between me and Deirdre in the Middle East. She admitted she felt awful for planning her affair in response to something so minor. She also explained why she had been going to the Red Roof Inn parking lot. While I was in Korea, her friend and colleague Carlota Jimenez was hiding her sister, Juanita, who had entered the U.S. illegally. Carlota couldn't hide Juanita at home because her husband was abusive, so she got her a job at the Red Roof Inn through Lydia, the hotel manager and a friend of hers. Marcy visited Juanita in the morning, while Carlota saw her in the evening. Interestingly, Marcy didn't even know Lydia was the manager, and Lydia never got involved with Juanita. Carlota and Marcy had many conversations about the problems in our relationship, discussing the misunderstandings that had nearly led us to divorce. For the first time in years, Marcy and I calmly and constructively talked through everything. I felt she was completely honest, and I didn't hold anything back either. That night, our intimacy felt like a second first time. It was probably the most meaningful moment we had ever shared. I have a gift for you before we go to bed, Marcy said with a mysterious smile, handing me a gift bag. Inside was the photo of us that she had picked up from the living room floor and put in a new frame. Thank you, Marcy, I said softly, smiling. Look at the back, she urged. It says Made in China, I joked. No, not that label, smart guy, she laughed. There was a small tag that said, Unbreakable. My love for her had survived. My faith in her was restored. As Winston Churchill once said, never waste a good crisis. Marcy and I had learned valuable lessons from this difficult time. We learned how to communicate our fears, doubts, gratitude, appreciation, and even our fantasies. I'm happier than ever, and judging by the bright smile I see on her face every morning, I know Marcy is too. Our children never found out how close we came to divorce, which is a relief. Penny and Josh Washington were also able to fix their relationship and have become our closest friends. As for Dr. Trey Cardoza, he wasn't promoted to surgical team leader due to behavioral issues and left the hospital 2 months after the Doctors Without Borders mission. No one missed him. A few weeks after Marcy returned from South America, Deirdre started dating someone. At first, she was skeptical about Marcy and me rekindling our relationship, but over time, she came around. Now she visits us for the weekend, and surprisingly, Marcy not only accepts it, she was the one who invited her. Leslie and Vincent Nielsen moved to the Midwest after Vincent got a job transfer. We still keep in touch through calls and messages. Jenny Harshley and Chuck Marston are now a couple, thanks to the little stunt I pulled at the Goldsteins. Marcy called Leslie in Chicago to tell her, and they laughed for about 10 minutes on the phone. Doug Atwater nearly lost it when I told him to toss the divorce papers. He called me a weakling, an idiot, and a few other choice names. I threatened to file a complaint with the Bar Association, and that shut him down quickly. Marcy was promoted to head nurse for the entire hospital. She has a better schedule and a much higher salary, and she's glowing with happiness. I'm still handling tough tasks at work, but I've returned to my first love, flying. With Marcy's blessing, I bought a Cessna 162, an impulse buy, but one I'm thrilled about. After reflecting on everything, I've come to realize that life often presents us with unexpected challenges, but these challenges can also become opportunities for growth. Marcy and I went through some of the hardest times in our marriage, but through open communication and a willingness to confront our pain, we found a way to reconnect. It wasn't an easy road. There were moments when I thought it was over, but sometimes the hardest paths lead to the strongest bonds. Our marriage is far from perfect, but it's real and it's ours. We've learned to communicate better, to listen without judgment, and to share our dreams and fears without reservation. The crisis we faced, instead of tearing us apart, brought us closer than ever before. I've also come to understand that relationships require constant effort. It's easy to take things for granted, to assume that everything will remain the same. But life doesn't work that way. People change, situations evolve, and if you don't adapt, you can lose sight of what truly matters. Looking back, I'm grateful for the lessons learned, for the mistakes we made, and for the love that, despite everything, never truly faded. Marcy and I have a second chance now, and we're determined to make the most of it. It's not about forgetting the past, but about learning from it and building a future that's even stronger. As I sit here now watching the sunset, I'm filled with hope. Hope for us, for our family, and for the life we've rebuilt together. Marcy's smile reminds me that we can survive anything, as long as we're willing to fight for each other. Life may not always be easy, but with her by my side, I know we can face whatever comes next.